our vision is really that women gaining more power, when we do look at it in terms of positional power, and being able to be in positions of power and make decisions, is about creating a world that works for everybody, and is about the way that we believe women look out for, and of course this is a generalization, that women will be concerned with the well-being of everybody. And it has to do with values.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told. And today I invite you to join me in conversation with Sarah Urech as we take a communication perspective on women's leadership. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means that we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope here is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Sarah Urech. She is the senior strategist and a founding member of the Omega Women's Leadership Center. She's also an improvisational storyteller with the Hudson River Playback Theatre. In the United States, March is Women's History Month, so that's why I'm taking this opportunity to share some important conversations with women about the experiences of women, which of course is very diverse and not something you can talk about using broad generalizations. So in these conversations, we use an intersectional lens and want to acknowledge the diversity and complexity and nuance of the lives of all women. So this conversation is the third in this series. We've spoken with Beth Fisher-Yoshida and Leah Leach so far. All right, so let's continue the conversation with Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
Good morning, Abby. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. I'm really looking forward to learning about you, your life, and your work, everything that you do.
It's a real pleasure to be on your podcast.
I'm glad that you feel that way. To start, can you introduce yourself? I know that there's many stories, many experiences, roles, relationships that make up who you are. It's possible to cover in such a short amount of time, but give us a place to start so we can get to know you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abby. Well, my name is Sarah Urech, she, her, and I am senior strategist at the Omega Institute for Holistic Studies, specifically of the Omega Women's Leadership Center and the Taking Care of Change initiative. And I've been at Omega for almost 13 years, and I know we'll talk more about the work that we do there. I am also a social worker. I'm a certified leadership and life coach, and I practice improvisational theater called Playback Theatre, where we act out people's stories from real life. So I bring all of those different professional fields and backgrounds to my work and to my life at large. And I live in New York's Hudson Valley. And I've been here. This is actually the 30th year. I have a 30th anniversary of living here.
That's awesome. Well, that is a great start. And yes, let's dive into it. Now that you've introduced yourself, can you introduce the Women's Leadership Center and talk about the work you do there?
Sure. The Women's Leadership Center at Omega is a center that offers an integrated approach to personal growth, to leadership development, and social change. And we, as a center, the center and our curriculum that we teach through some of our programs grew out of the Women in Power conference series, which actually was started in 2002. Omega Institute has been around since 1977 and has been providing innovative programming and retreats and workshops and conferences to many thousands of people from around the world. And we have served over all these decades, primarily women who are seeking to make changes in their own lives, who are seeking to make and help effectuate changes in the world. And our co-founder of Omega Institute, Elizabeth Lesser, who's a best-selling author and spiritual teacher, she created the Women in Power Conference series. It actually happened out of a conversation she had with Eve Ensler, the playwright of the Vagina Monologues and social change activist who created V-Day. They were talking about women in power and what does it mean when you put those two words together, and how do we define power? Do women have a particular role to play in how power exists or perhaps shifts and changes in the world? And they started inviting women from around the world who were inspirational leaders, activists, change makers, politicians, educators, scientists, artists, to talk about that topic. And so that was the starting place. It became an annual conference, and we're still holding it now every other year at Omega. And the women who were coming, because quite a number of them were returning year after year, said, it's wonderful to hear stories from these inspiring global leaders. But what about me? What do I do? How can I make changes in my life, my personal life at home, my role at work, and how I show up in my community? And ultimately, what my contribution is during my lifetime to the world. And so that was the genesis of creating a curriculum and programs that are more in depth than that one weekend conference. Mm-hmm. So we've developed a curriculum. I've been part of that team who has been building, refining, and constantly evolving the curriculum, because even in the dozen years that I've been at Omega, things have changed a lot in the world, in the field of women's leadership. How we define gender is shifting, how power is defined in the world, albeit, has so long been focused on power over systems of domination, that still are very much how the world operates. Yes. But I think the awareness has been shifting, and that's come more and more to the mainstream. In Omega's history, it was always about looking at shifting consciousness from the very early days. In fact, the reason that the organization, and we are a nonprofit organization, that we have the name Omega Institute, was an inspiration from Pir Vilayat Khan, who was a mentor to Elizabeth Lesser and Stefan Rechtschaffen, who co-founded Omega, and who said, the Omega point, as coined by the priest and philosopher Teilhard de Chardin, is about a point in human consciousness where there can be a shift. So it's always been thinking about how can we shift consciousness, and where do we start? That's also been the question. Do we start within? Do we start out in the world?
Right.
Yeah. And I love that so much about the work of the Women's Leadership Center, because our focus is really about how do we bring those two together? How do we bring an awareness of systems and structures that do still organize our society and our world?
Yeah.
And how do we also redefine power? Because if we can access power from within, and I think in your podcast, you focus on this so much, how tools of communication are the key for how we can bring our personal power forward in the world. And so I continue to find the work exciting. It certainly is, as I said, shifting as things change in the world. And it's really continues to be very stimulating. And just these big existential questions. How do we live?
Yeah.
How do we change as human beings? How do we change ourselves? How do we change our communities that we live in?
Yeah, I love this focus on, really at, a very basic level to start consciousness raising, or, kind of building awareness. Yeah. And I don't say basic to diminish the value of that, because I think that's so important, but just kind of a, first step, and then action can follow from there. But I think a lot of times we want to jump straight to the action, but the consciousness building awareness part is so important. I think for the sake of naming things, that's why consciousness raising groups were so important for women.
Yes.
Because there were things that they were experiencing that nobody had named yet. So you can't talk
Exactly.
about something if you don't have the language to describe it. And you might have a version of awareness because it's something you've experienced in your life, but not an awareness to the point of, oh, other people experience this too. And this is what I want to call it. And this is what it means to me. And this is, the way that it interacts with other parts of our lives. So I love that as a start. And to kind of stay in this area of naming, I want to start by talking about how, this Women Empower conference turned into a leadership center. What was the line from Women Empowered to really wanting to focus on leadership? And also, again, to get specific, how are you defining leadership? How are you understanding it in your work?
Well, it is a jump that happened because it was the question that the people attending were asking, how do I do this in my own world?
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to help provide tools and skills and an approach and, kind of practices that could help people to do that.
Yeah.
So I think it happened very organically over time, and for Omega, wanting to build something that originated within Omega, because we host many spectacular teachers and speakers from all over. And that is, been primarily how we've been able to make a big contribution to the field of holistic education and wellness and social change. And so this is the Women's Leadership Center is one of our centers. We also have the Center of Sustainable Living, where we do a host of educational programs. And also we actually have on site a wastewater reclamation facility that is cutting edge, that engages plants to actually clean the water that's used by all the people on campus.
Wow.
So that in and of itself is an education. It's a way of, again, you could say it's also about consciousness, because it's about us in today's society returning to an awareness that certainly is held in many indigenous cultures of our interconnectedness with the planet that we live on and all the beings that live here with us, in addition to humans. So anyway, we have the Center for Sustainable Living. We do mindfulness in education. There's a number of projects that we focus on more in depth. So I would say that leadership in all of these areas, leadership is key, because leadership is about power and who holds power and where the decision-making is happening in our society. So again, I feel like for me, it's been, we can bring together so many different fields through the lens of leadership, because really people come to our programs from all different fields, and they may be in social services, they may be in the corporate world, they may be in education, they may be artists, they may be working really primarily in transforming communities and doing grassroots social change work. But a lot of the questions pertain across all these different sectors. And really that we can, through being in community with each other, we can learn so much about, just our own evolution.
Yeah. The reason I ask about how you understand leadership is because as I reflected, getting ready for this conversation, I thought, well, the space that I most hear leadership talked about is in the corporate world. People are talking about it on LinkedIn, and it's kind of this buzzword in this way. Yes. But leadership is so much more expansive than that. Like you're saying, what you heard from these women that were at these conferences is that they are experiencing opportunities maybe to be in leadership in their communities in ways that are outside of, the corporate world, and what kind of a quote leader are you in your business, but even beyond that. And I think that's, important to kind of understand the breadth of it.
Absolutely. I think we really need to take that definition beyond the idea of positional power that people hold.
Right.
And really see how people can have leadership impact in a whole host of different ways. And so we do we define it broadly. One of the things that's been interesting as we've engaged with women over the years is that a lot of people actually don't feel so comfortable with that title or that term and don't necessarily see themselves as a leader. But if we're evaluating from the outside, we would certainly say that they are practicing leadership.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing about, one of the things about our curriculum is that we really look at leadership also as something that is not simply completed at the end of a workday. It's not, again, it's not boxed in that way. It's also how we lead our lives. It's also how we care for ourselves, how we understand ourselves, and how we make sense of what happens to us in daily life. So when we teach in our programs, we really help people to focus on, as we say, it's sort of the 3-part framework of the personal and what's going on inside, all the practices that we might need and that might help us in order to evolve ourselves and learn about ourselves, and also just sustain, to have sustenance and continue to strengthen ourselves in our relational area, in the relationships that we hold, whether that's in our workplace, at home, in our communities, and then our connection to structures or systems of power and how we relate to that. So it's all of those things. We have a residency in addition to some of our professional trainings and workshops and conferences. We also have a residency for women leaders. And that's an opportunity. And again, we define that broadly, women leaders, but it's people who are in that instance, who are focused on making a difference in the lives of others, in particular, women and girls. But it's an opportunity for people to come to Omega's campus and have some restoration and a chance to, again, have a different perspective. Sometimes people do projects while they're on residency, but it is a way of, you talked earlier about naming and, proclaiming things, perhaps in response to how maybe as women we've been oppressed in the dominant culture. But by naming ourselves as leaders, by naming that it's important to have rest, it's important to have restoration. It's important to have an opportunity to get away and have a different perspective. These are some of the practices that we have. And within that too, one of the things that we look at in our curriculum is about how as women, we are not, we have many differences because we all hold multiple identities. Yeah. And those distinguish some of the ways that we experience the world. Again, when we think about how systems and structures operate and how power plays out in the world. So we want to be really sensitive and mindful to what we teach about an intersectional analysis, an approach that really honors that our experiences as women are radically different based on other identities, such as race and class and our gender identity and our sexual orientation and ability and religion and many others.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make, that even if we're using the term, women's leadership, that's, not making a generalization, not trying to paint it with such a broad brush, because within that, like you're saying, there's so much nuance in individual people's experiences. And what you're saying about women that you encounter going, oh, well, I don't really see myself as a leader, maybe kind of struggling with that identity. It makes me think of the stories that we tell and that we internalize, and that there are so many stories that have told women that you don't get to be in the leadership position, or the way that you go about things is not the kind of leadership that we value. And it's reminding me of a conversation. I just wrapped up a series on speaking to like artists and writers and some creatives in February. And one of the themes that kind of kept coming up was this idea of like, people are kind of relating to creativity or art in, I don't want to say the wrong way, but in a kind of unhelpful way, to say, oh, well, I'm a creative person, or I'm just not a creative person, or I'm just not an artist, and making it an identity rather than something you do, so kind of like creativity being this quality that any of us can grab onto. It is available to all of us. It's maybe just more about the stories we've been told. And so talking about women in leadership, it's not so much a question of, well, are you innately or not a leader? but what are the stories you've been told, and how can you see leadership as a quality, as a role that you can take on for yourself?
Changing the narrative of what is a leader and what is leadership is critical. And I think storytelling, and that's a focus that you have, that's so important, because it is true that we have received and imbibed and internalized certain stories. And it's beyond time to be shifting that. And, it's fun in the work that sitting in the trainings with women to listen to their stories of how they took action and how they were bold and how they perhaps had to work with some inner barriers, or inner barriers that may be perceived, in order to step out and make some of those shifts. I fully agree. There's a lot to be done in terms of shifting narratives about leadership and power. And the other thing I want to say too, in terms of our focus on women leaders, as we were talking about, is that our vision is really that women gaining more power, when we do look at it in terms of positional power, and being able to be in positions of power and make decisions, is about creating a world that works for everybody, and is about the way that we believe women look out for, and of course this is a generalization, exceptions and so on, but that women will be concerned with the well-being of everybody. And that's across gender and across gender identity. And it has to do with values, has to do with a values-based leadership, which is one of the focuses that we have in our curriculum. We have the 5 V's, and values is one of those: voice and vision and vessel and voyage. So we're also talking about giving people a chance to look at their values, also seeing how they play out in our everyday lives. And then being able to engage with the other V's in terms of our vessels, in terms of our connection to our body, because that's another area where many of us across gender feel disconnected from our bodies, disconnected from the wisdom that our bodies can hold. So some of the embodied practices that we offer help to guide people back into that connection with their own innate intuition, with their capacity to withstand challenges and get refueled and reignited through the body.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about what I see your work is doing, is kind of helping women to tell a new story about what is possible. And I'll go so broad as to say, helping everyone to begin to tell a new story about what women's leadership can mean. But before we kind of get into that, I'm curious if we together can kind of name, I know you've, said that you've heard many, many stories. Can we name some of the old stories? I'd like to think of them as old stories, at least. I know they're still very persistent. But can we name some of the stories about women or about leadership that have kept women out of leadership roles, or out of seeing that as something that they could claim for themselves?
Sure. And we can just riff on this and feel free to jump in. Actually, Elizabeth Lesser, in her book, Cassandra Speaks, really goes into this in some depth, some of the cultural stories that have been told, that women are very emotional, and women are driven by emotion, for example. And so that qualities of a leader are to be rational, to be sort of scientific in approach. That might be one sort of set of stories about leadership. There's so much to do with the mind, I think, as well. And this is an interesting topic because there is, fortunately, a lot of awareness about mindfulness in the mainstream culture increasingly, and the importance of how we can work with our mind through meditation and other practices, because it can be quite challenging, a human mind. There's a lot of chatter that goes on and that is not helpful to us being the most actualized and fulfilled. But I think that in the way our education system works, this is why I was talking about the body earlier. The mind is so prioritized.
Yeah.
And that can be a narrative that's told about how, and maybe it's not even articulated quite this way, but academic learning,
Right.
academic knowledge is vastly prioritized, and less so intuitive knowledge or embodied knowledge or kinesthetic. These are all connected.
Mm-hmm.
Kinesthetic awareness that also have a lot to teach us. A lot of the ways that the world works in terms of, as I was saying earlier, power over and domination, they require a disconnect from the heart, from the sense of empathy and compassion that I know you're working with so much to kind of bring forward and elevate in the work of communication. So those are some. What did you think of any others?
Yes, no, I was going to bring us back to that difference between power over and power with, which we can define in a moment too. But yes, as I think about the kind of leadership that has been, kind of risen up and valued, is more about, being right and kind of a dominance and being assertive. And I think it has been allowed for us to understand leadership in this way for so long because we haven't been mindful about it. We haven't given ourselves the space of reflection, because I think now that people are maybe starting is, not even accurate. I know there's been many people that have already been doing this kind of work for a long time. But as you were saying, I think more as a society, it's starting to become more part of this kind of mainstream awareness of, well, is this actually even working? And have we even asked ourselves that before? And that's such a big part of what it means to me to take this communication perspective, is that, yes, you're centering the communication and seeing it as what I'd call a constitutive force, so that it has this creative energy in it, that in our ability to create our own social worlds, we're doing that through our communication. And if we want better social worlds, then we need better communication practices.
Yes.
This is, a long kind of if this, then that. But the only way then to get better communication practices is if you can take a moment to look back, try to recognize different patterns, recognize the stories that were shaping you and where you were acting from. Then you can decide, okay, how did I get here? Do I like where I'm at? And then how do I want to act going forward based on what my idea of a better social world is?
Absolutely.
Part of the reason why the version of leadership that's been allowed to kind of take precedence for so long has only been allowed to do so because we haven't been actively reflecting on it. We haven't brought a mindfulness to it that allows us to even ask, is this working for us? Is this what we want to be making? And so if we can look back, then that in it of itself is the moment, which I imagine that's the moment you're trying to create for people in your work at the Women's Leadership Center, to say, take this moment. You use the word restoration, take this moment, reflect. What have you seen? What are the stories that you've been told? Does it actually work? Because maybe some of the stories are good that you have been told. And so you want to keep on with those and pass those on as stories. But also that's your opportunity to revisit those stories. And for example, in this conversation, revisit the kind of leadership that you've seen. And that's the moment where you can say, well, no, maybe a leadership that is centered around empathy and compassion and collaboration instead of dominance. That could be a new way forward that is effective.
Yes. And I think that we can learn a lot from nature. And that is also something that we've built into our curriculum.
Yeah.
So we think of even in the natural structures, we think of a dominance model.
Yeah.
But more and more, scientists are uncovering what I think is already contained within indigenous wisdom for millennia, which is that plants, for example, communicate with each other and take care of each other. And they have this kind of model of collaboration, the mycelial networks, what's sometimes referred to as the wood wide web, that's underneath most of the planet, the land-based part of our planet. There's an intelligence there that is cooperative. It is networked. It is diverse. And so it's those qualities that are actually supporting the sustenance of life, and the well-being of the organisms, in the ecosystem. And so we can use that as a basis to say, well, how can we actually shift how we operate with each other? How can we say that that is a kind of leadership when we're looking out for each other?
Mm-hmm.
And we can think about where, let's say, in family systems, things work well, right? It's often when there's multiple generations involved. It's often when there are these values of compassion and care and equity and valuing of everybody, because of somebody's younger and somebody's older doesn't devalue them.
Mm-hmm.
But it is, everybody's needed to be whole.
Yeah.
And that we can be guided by. So that's all about shifting patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about shifting, again, consciousness. It's about shifting how we think about these things and these interactions. But I personally, I find that so exciting, because I've seen in a number of ways when communities work together. And this, one of the examples for this for me personally is in my theater work, where we operate as a team. We actually listen deeply to the stories that people tell us from their lives, and then we act them out improvisationally. And we do that as a team. It's not a solo forum. And so we need to be, as performers together, listening very deeply to each other. We need to have a sense of empathy for each other, a sense of, again, kind of kinesthetic listening and awareness.
Right.
And with a team of people, and this is, again, called Playback Theatre, and it exists all over the world, but it came from here in the Hudson Valley. It's a form that really helps to build those skills. So I feel grateful. I've been doing that for 30 years now, and I have really been able to, it's helped grow me as a human being. I was quite young when I started, and I've had experiences all over the world, listening to people's stories, reflecting them, or teaching other people to do so in a way that has really shaped who I am and how I can see that even while we have so many differences, and we're living in a time where the divisions just seem to get more and more heightened, but there tend to be basic commonalities of people wanting to be well, to be healthy, to be fulfilled, hopefully, if we're getting beyond basic needs, to have good connection and to have joy in those connections, to take good care of their children. We did a long-term project with Hudson River Playback Theatre that I'm part of with immigrants here in the Hudson Valley from all over the world, but primarily from Mexico and a number of other South American countries. And predominantly people are coming, as they expressed it to us, because they're searching for a better life for their children.
Yeah.
And that's that's a value that most people can relate to. Wanting to take good care of their children and raise them and have them have fulfilled and oftentimes more fulfilled, more satisfying lives than they were able to have themselves. And so if that is something that's a central value that many human beings share, there must be a collective will for that to happen on a planetary level. Yeah. But these forces of dominance that we've brought up, a few times, continue to be central. And so I think that's where all this work about how can we change the narratives? How can we know that there is power in those values of goodness, of care, of equity, of justice, of love.
Yeah. I guess it makes sense that a dominance approach would dominate based on that being exactly the function of it. And I so appreciate you beginning to talk about playback theater, because that is exactly what I was thinking as you spoke about collaboration. That is so central to the communication theory that my work is based in, is coordinated management of meaning. And when I talk about a communication perspective, a lot of what I'm talking about is inspired by that theory. And my goal is to try to make all of this much more accessible, because I know I lose people. I feel like immediately when I say coordinated management of meaning and try to get into the theory and the weeds of it all. But at the heart of it, there is some really great tools, some really great language, again, that can help people understand. And my hope is, and what my experience has been, to feel empowered in their communication, see themselves as, again, active participants. And to get back to what I was trying to say, a key element of that is this notion of collaboration, that we are in relationship. We live in societies, we live in communities. And so in your meaning making, in your storytelling that you're doing, you're going to have to collaborate. And so what does that look like to collaborate? And in your collaboration, you can be responsible for yourself, but you're going to have to get to know your collaboration, your conversation partner. And you might not know how they're going to show up if you are just getting to know them. And so that takes me to this idea of improv, or what we talk about as like emergence. And that's something that I think about as I approach these conversations, is to be guided by emergence. And so that's why, I sent you a couple questions in advance. I like to do that so that people feel comfortable, feel like they have a little bit of an idea. But mostly I want this conversation to emerge, and for us to just be able to co-create, for us to collaborate in this conversation itself and create something, meaningful and cool, and kind of give it the space again to breathe. Improv is something that is also talked about in the CMM community a lot, because there's a lot of people that I get to speak to and work with that are jazz musicians or do improv comedy. And so they bring this perspective, which I think has been so valuable, to say that, there is this collaboration that is just required. You just cannot, dominate. You have to collaborate. You have to listen deeply. All of these things you're talking about. You have to reflect, you have to respond. Yes. And, that kind of thing to create something really beautiful together.
Yes. Yeah. It's such a stimulating practice to give over so fully to the moment and the unknown. I think in a lot of contexts, people are quite afraid of that, but here we are in this particular performance form where that's what we're always inviting. We're always inviting an emergent process in a group setting where we have an audience, and, there may be a particular context. People have come together. There may be a theme for the performance, or it may not be. It may be an open theme. We are stepping into the unknown. We are saying that as a community, we can have a dialogue. We can elevate people's everyday stories. Doesn't have to be going to the movies and seeing the big stars. Or, the projects that had to make it all the way through to get funded, to get produced and made into media. But it's like everyday people's regular stories and reflections. And the idea is that they contain so much wisdom. And as you say, the model of how we collaborate and how we create theater in front of people's eyes, where they know exactly that we don't have this prepared. We didn't already know what we were coming to perform and present, but it's emergent, it's unfolding. There's such a trust in a kind of collective wisdom and the power of the arts. And I think it opens us up to a tremendous amount of, again, wisdom and joy. And we don't usually talk about it this way, but it's a resilience practice, because to be able to step so fully into the unknown, there's something that's going to come that's larger than any of us, and that nobody had been able to kind of prefabricate or design. It can be profoundly healing and very affirming, but it's not, we don't consider it therapy as such. It can be therapeutic, but it's more about community dialogue and art, the role of the arts in creating change, in envisioning a different world. And so to me, it's interesting in my life that it's now, I mean, playback theater has been in my life for 30 years,
Yeah.
very long time.
Yeah.
And now I've been doing the women's leadership work at Omega for such a long time. And in a way, they both invite us to look at power differently and to really dream a different way of being in power, of expressing power, of sharing power. Really like the idea in playback is that the community is the wisdom holder, the meaning maker.
Yeah.
And that it's actually only collectively that we can find our way forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Such a great point. And to me, it's so clear how your work with the playback theater could, kind of go hand in hand, or you could talk about those two in the same breath, your work with the Women's Leadership Center, as well as, this improv, this emergence, this community, this collaboration that you see happening at the playback theater. And I think that's wonderful. And I'm glad you bring us back to power, because when I think about, okay, let's reflect on the old stories. We've already done a little bit of that. And then let's look forward. What are the new stories we want to be telling? I see that as being that difference between power over and power with. If the old story is power over, then the new story is power with. And like we've said, quote unquote, women's leadership is not to say, okay, well, women are like this, and this is what women's leadership looks like. But I think is, another way to talk about this old story and new story is that an old story has been maybe a more masculine form of leadership, or a form of leadership that has placed value on traits that have traditionally been identified as being masculine. And a new story could be, quote unquote, women's leadership. And by that, I really mean, a leadership that places value on traits that have traditionally not been valued, because they have been connected with femininity in some way, and thus devalued in a patriarchal society. So I kind of appreciate that distinction in the language, to again say it's not just, oh, well, a man being in a place of leadership is innately bad, a woman being in a place of leadership is innately good. The story is not as simple as that, for sure.
We did an event at Omega last year that I feel epitomizes what we're talking about here, and really brought together many strands for me personally and for our work at Omega. It was called the Wellbeing Summit, gathering at the intersection of well-being and social change. It was an event that we actually curated the audience for. We collaborated with a global organization called the Wellbeing Project. They seeded this particular movement of creating well-being summits that focus on the integration of well-being and social change. And we were the first regional summit of its nature. Now there's going to be, they're one of 5 last year, and there's 14 more this year. And it really spans the entire globe. It's very exciting. There's one happening, I believe, in Bangladesh shortly. So It's really all over the world. And really, we were able to have this conversation about the importance of bringing the practice, as well as the knowledge and the understanding and the valuing of well-being, into the work of social change, and where activists are working so hard, expending really so much energy and resources and ingenuity in very grueling conditions. And that the bringing together of those worlds is something that's needed in order to shift the global conversation. And it really embedded in that is leadership, and what kind of leadership, right? All these questions we've been talking about, it's about the collective, it's about the value of care and equity, and that can be guiding, that we can work cooperatively. And so it was very exciting to have change leaders, mostly from our region, North America region, coming together. We also partnered with Harlem Wellness Center, which is a wonderful wellness-focused organization based in Harlem that we're very deeply in partnership with for many years now at Omega. And we brought presenters, many of whom were teachers that have worked with Omega for many years and brought their expertise. We had extraordinarily rich conversation about these topics. We centered presenters and teachers and leaders of color. So we had the conversation about racial healing in the mix. It was about redefining power. It was about, going beyond just bringing together wellness and social change, but actually talking about how are those things actually all deeply interconnected and even the same thing. And so it was, for me, really exciting to see this kind of integration of all these different worlds. I brought together a playback theater team that could do a performance and reflect the stories of our delegates about change, about ancestry, about healing and transcending oppression. So I feel that there is really space and interest and excitement for, making these changes. And we just also need to keep an Omega, we have the wonderful opportunity and gift to be able to offer a space where people can also sort of get what they need to sustain themselves and gather their strength and learn and grow. And so, yeah, for me, that was a coming together. We actually used the 5 V's that I was describing earlier as a learning framework to organize that whole event. So we brought that curriculum element, to the wider world beyond women's leadership. And for me, it was really a really thrilling achievement. And to see how these summits are continuing around the globe and to feel connected. The Being Project as an organization has really kept all of these organizers, continues to keep all these organizers connected because of the understanding that in each of our locations, we can make change, but we're so vastly strengthened and rooted if we can do that with a sense of a global partnership, a sense of a global collective that's doing this. So I think that's true in any field. I'm sure that you find that as well with communication, expanding notions of communication and shifting them as the more we can spread that and feel that we're connected to people who are doing that all over and in different fields. Yeah. So empowering.
Yes, I'm so glad to hear you talk about space. And I think it gets a little meta, but it matters, I think, to do that, you talking about well-being and, name any of the events you put on. I think, talking about creating a space where people can think about their space, especially related to well-being, just, provide the opportunity to be more thoughtful. And that's something that I talk about a lot when it comes to communication. There's this outdated understanding of communication that is still, probably a lot of people's main way of thinking about communication. And that is, I say something to you and you hear it, and that's communication.
Right.
But really, it's not just what you said. It is also how you say things. And then it is also the space that you are speaking into. And so I think so much about that space, because I'm not going to feel comfortable to be vulnerable or be authentic or tell my story if the space that I am speaking into has not made me feel comfortable to do so. So I, think about meta communicating, which would be communicating about how we're communicating, which is the whole thing that I do.
Yeah.
And it can maybe seem a little diluted or abstract to people, but I think matters so much, especially when you're talking about the meaning you're making. And that's what I see you doing as, again, this work of naming and saying, okay, well, let's actually look very closely at leadership. Let's very closely look at these stories and let me reflect them back to you, for example, with your work with playback theater. So I love to think about the space that we create in our relationships with each other and how we can be intentional about what kind of space do we actually want to create, because what's that space going to allow for us? How are we going to be able to show up to that space?
Yes. I just am thinking how that continues to change over our lifetime.
Yes. Yeah.
And especially now, having come through such a big chapter with the pandemic.
Yeah.
Come through for the most part.
Yeah.
That we've all been changed in some way, and that we can hopefully be informed by that to make the best possible changes and healthy changes. But I also think that people are in need of connecting in new ways and different ways. And we're excited to create spaces. We're doing our online courses coming up This spring, we do that online. A lot of our programs, of course, are on the Omega campus, but, you know, it's a chance for people to connect with a community and share some of these struggles that people have been through and create some of that space to really be seen, to reflect, to ask questions, to explore what's going on and what's needing to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Sarah, as we wrap up, I want to give us a chance maybe to just kind of, do our own reflecting on this conversation, give us a chance to reiterate some of the things we've already said and ask for you to share what, in your words, again, I know it could be different for many people involved in the work you do. It could mean many different things, but for you, what are the new stories that you're hoping to tell, and how is this work that you're doing part of moving us toward a better social world for everybody?
Yeah, it's such a joyful part of the work to me to think about how we could really change our way of interacting in the world. And I do think that it's like all things, we people feel like, oh, the big challenges are so big. How do I make change? How do I do something about that? And we really have to keep coming back to what some of the wonderful contemplative practices and embodied practices teach us, which is, you know, it comes back to this moment and how am I showing up in this moment? How am I showing up in relation to myself, you know, to those around me and the social themes that are going on? So I feel like I've had what I sometimes refer to as glimpses of liberation.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually the Wellbeing Summit was an example of that.
Yeah.
Where we were able to be together with 150 change leaders and have really deep and meaningful conversation and reflection on these social themes that are not easy and can be really, really challenging to bring up, but where there can be an approach of love and people can, it's just a different model of conflict. It's a way of, you know, through deep listening, through really seeing each other and the spaciousness that you were just talking about as well, we can have a different approach. And so we can coexist and invite people to be their most fully expressed, inhabited in their being exactly as they uniquely are, you know, as we all uniquely are. I feel that gives me sustenance when I picture that kind of gathering. And one of the things that happened is that we hadn't really planned specifically. I mean, we map out everything, you know, like to the minute at Omega with these bigger events, especially. Not all the events. I mean, the Women's Leadership Workshop, actually, a lot of it is so emergent. We have like broad topics that we're covering, and then the group kind of takes us in all this different ways.
Yes, we call it minimal structure.
There you go. But with the bigger conferences, you know, there's so many people to work with. And anyway, but there was emergent singing that happened. And I love to sing. And that's something that brings me a lot of joy and connection with others, you know, singing, especially if you sing in harmony or you sing in group. So there are these moments of singing that emerged where a speaker would just start and lead a song, or another speaker invited a particular gospel song that she remembered. And then a couple of the presenters came together to perform that, to prepare and perform that. And it was done with so much love and beauty, and the energy. It doesn't necessarily have to be the content of that, but the energy of how people can show up in music and song. To me, those are I've painted a picture of how we could live differently. And, you know, it's a vitality. It's a strength of energy. It's a life force. And it's, again, like that. I feel like to me, it becomes, they used to say when in the old days of the movies, you know, when it became Technicolor, it's like, you know, like the rainbow, all the colors of the rainbow can be finally displayed, and people can really, truly be fully expressed as they are and honored. So to me, that's that's the picture that just warms me and keeps me motivated
Yeah.
to do the work.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that, and so beautifully said, and something that I relate to, because I feel so lucky that I get to do this, because the conversations I have are so life-giving. So those feel like my moments of glimpses into the future of what could be, especially getting to talk to so many people that are actively, you know, in one way or another, working towards these better social worlds, because we got to come at it from all angles. And there's a lot of things that we could be doing better, or people are doing better, and just, you know, need to get it in front of people. And so,
and then we all learn from each other.
Right. So I hope that for everyone to get to have the kind of experiences that you and I have, where we get those glimpses, because I think that's what, keeps me hopeful and keeps me feeling passionate about, putting any energy towards making better social worlds.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you so much. I've so appreciated your time and your perspective, and getting to learn about everything you do.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you today.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Sarah. At the end of each episode, I like to offer some questions to reflect on, which acts as a kind of next turn, so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, I have 2 questions for you. One is, where do we start? And the second is, how do we bring an awareness of systems and structures, and also redefine power within our own selves? Obviously, these questions are inspired by our conversation with Sarah today. We talked about leadership meaning many different things to many different people. So I think that leaves us with the question of, where do we start? Taking a kind of inventory, doing a kind of reflection on our own lives, and looking for the leadership potential, the leadership opportunities in each of our own lives. And then that second question, I just kind of want to acknowledge, again, the complexity of a kind of both and approach of acknowledging the systems and structures that we exist in, and then also kind of doing internal work so that we ourselves can show up differently, and kind of both of those parts being important to changing the way we think about power, the way we think about leadership and women. I always invite you to reach out to me if you'd like to share your reflections to those questions. Also, reach out if you have any questions of your own or ideas you want to share. You can do that through email, through the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. And links to all those places are in the show notes. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. Some other great ways to keep dialogue going is to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, and most importantly to me, share an episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation. As always, I'm supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward better social worlds. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives at the links I have provided in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.